So last week we rushed through the last few verses to make sure that we finished chapter 5. So that was an event with Jesus healing somebody in Jerusalem, and then a whole bunch of fallout from that. And this is just how the structure of many of the chapters in the first half of John goes. Like Jesus has some sort of saying or some sort of miracle, and then you have a lot of discussion and pushback from the general populace who witnesses this event. So today we're going to be beginning John chapter 6, and it's going to be the same type of structure. And I think it's going to be a little bit interesting for us because this is based on the feeding of the 5,000. And, well, this is a very familiar story to all of us. I mean, like this is preached every single year in our lectionary. So usually it's the story from Mark or the story from Luke or the story from Matthew, because when you look at how the readings go in our worship services, usually it's following one of those gospels, and then the Gospel of John just gets parts interjected in between some of those readings. So the Gospel of John is scattered throughout. So for this, when we're looking at the whole thing, like the whole chapter, the discussion and everything, it might be interesting to see the different directions John is going. And that's why I have my handy-dandy synopsis of the four Gospels, which I wanted to break out especially for this. So what a synopsis does is it has, let me just turn to the opinion of 5,000. There we go. So what it does is it has all four Gospel accounts read side by side, so you can see who says what, and you can see the differences, the similarities, and what's going on between the writers. And as we go through the chapter, you'll also find that maybe one of the writers doesn't have anything to say about a particular event, or one or more of the writers. Because if I turn the page a little bit more, for the bread of life discourse, this is what the big talk Jesus has afterwards. Only John has something to say. The other guys don't record this. So it's always useful to have this type of thing out when you're trying to study one of the stories in the gospel readings, because you can see, well, who says what and maybe what their focus is. So as we go through the feeding of the 5,000, you'll find that John's focus is slightly different. And I'll try to bring that out as we go through. Especially why he has a different focus. So, sharing my screen. This is the ESV online.
Struggling with my memory a little bit. Were there two accounts? Is there a feeding of 4,000?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. There's two, isn't there? Is there actually two, or?
There's actually two.
Okay.
Just a moment. Because I'm pretty sure that comes up a couple chapters later. And I'm trying to remember whether this is, yep, it's just in Mark and Matthew. So Luke and John don't talk about that particular event. But usually, if you find a historical event in Mark, it will be accounted for in Matthew. If you find only two writers talking about maybe a saying of Jesus, usually it's going to be Mark and Luke. But Mark usually has everything laid out, and then Matthew and Luke really try to grab on to Mark as a whole. In fact, about 90 to 95% of Mark, depending on how you want to count the words, is found in Matthew and Luke. But Mark, if he has some sort of event, usually he puts in a little bit more detail than Matthew or Luke. Luke will be more technical in his terminology, but Mark tends to be a little bit more verbose. Not a lot more, but a little bit. Again, it's fun to contrast them every now and again. So for right now, we're going to be focusing on the feeding of the 5,000 and the immediate aftermath. So what immediately happens afterwards. So we're looking at John chapter 6, verses 1 to 15, that big block there. So actually, no. Let's break that up a little bit. Let's break it up a little bit so that we can get some context. Let's just start with verses 1 to 4.
Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, that is, the Sea of Tiberias, and a great crowd of the people followed him because they saw the miraculous signs he had performed on the sick. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover feast was near.
So John is giving us the who, what, where, when. But very simple. So you have the location, which is the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, that is the Sea of Tiberias. He doesn't really give us too much more than that. But if you compare this to some of the other gospel accounts, they are more specific and say that this is Gennesaret. What does that mean for us? Not too much unless you know the geography. But it is, if you look at the Sea of Galilee, Capernaum is going to be pretty much on the north end. And then if you kind of rotate a little bit to the west, that's where Gennesaret is. So it's actually not too far away from Capernaum. It's going to be like a few hours walk, if that. Actually, maybe even only a 1 hour walk. There's also a historical site. I remember the name. Hetagamon? Gamamon? I don't know, it's Greek. It means 7 rivers. Place of the 7 rivers. And that was supposed to be the historic site of the feeding of the 5,000. But really, it was some guy in the 5th century said, oh, this must be the place. And then they just built a monastery there. So it's not really the place, but they just say that it's the place. The closest we get is Gennesaret. Do we know exactly where that is? No. All we know is that it's actually near a hill. So for the Sea of Galilee, Sea of Tiberias, why are they saying Sea of Tiberias? Well, the city of Tiberias, so this is on the west shore. So if you think Sea of Galilee, Capernaum in the north, Tiberias will be on the west. Opposite that, that's where you get a place called Ein Gev. That won't be too familiar to anybody. That's basically, but that's near where Jesus was casting out the demon legion. There was a guy who was among the tombs, and Jesus asked him, "Who are you?" And he says, "Well, I'm Legion because I am many." And then Jesus cast out the demons, and they went into a herd of pigs. Yeah, that's the other side of the shore. South side, not too much, but that's where the River Jordan comes up. Tiberias was actually a burial site, a Jewish burial site, but they decided to make a town there in 18 AD, named after the Roman Emperor Tiberius, basically to curry some favor with him. Because if you want to get in good with the king or an emperor, well, then you just make a city and name it after them. That's what you do. But since it was a Hebrew burial ground, no one wanted to go there because you'll be ceremonially unclean as soon as you enter the town. Then what are you going to do? So it wasn't until about a century after its foundation, so the middle of the 2nd century, that was actually a big booming town when they decided, well, we don't have the temple in Jerusalem anymore. We don't want to go down to Jerusalem anymore because that's where the Romans have a lot of their power base. So let's go somewhere else. And then Tiberias actually became the center of the rabbinic community for a few centuries. So John, what he's really getting at here by also saying this is the Sea of Tiberias, is he's getting at, I'm writing this not just for Jews, I'm writing this for the Romans, like the people who actually know where this city is. Because Hebrews, they'll know where it is, but they won't care about it. So why on earth would you name it, talk about Tiberias? John's trying to be a little bit more inclusive, going, oh, look, you guys should know this name. And that's basically what it is. But I'll also mention, since this is actually near Capernaum, a wrong understanding of the eating of the Lord's Supper actually comes from this, because we'll get later on into the misunderstanding of the Jews, because Jesus is going to say, well, you have no life in you unless you eat my body and drink my blood. And then the Jews go like, oh, we don't like cannibalism, and then they start falling away. So during the Reformation, when you have a misunderstanding of the Lord's Supper, basically it was leveled against the Lutherans. And I think it was actually by both sides, both the Roman Catholics and the Reformed, where they were saying, oh, well, since you don't believe in transubstantiation, or you don't believe that this is simply a memorial miracle and nothing's actually happening, that you actually believe that bits of flesh and blood are present in the supper, and that you're actually chomping on Jesus and rending his body apart with your teeth. Not too pleasant an image. And we go like, no, that's not what we believe. But that's what's called the Copernican eating. And we're probably going to get into that a little bit more once we get a bit further along the chapter. But yeah, that's why it's called that. So that's the place. And verse 2 there, a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he had performed by healing the sick. Now it's interesting to actually compare that statement with what's going on in the other Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Because Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they're saying that the great crowd is actually following Jesus because this is occurring right after Jesus sends out the 12 to the surrounding communities. So the 12 go out to as many towns as they can in a period of time, spread the news of Jesus Christ, and then they come back. The crowd is actually supposed to be those who are following the disciples back to Jesus. But here John is talking about performing the healing of the sick. So if we're trying to weigh the two accounts, what's actually probably happening is the disciples have gone out, said, this is Jesus Christ, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world, and people go, okay, sure. By the way, you can heal the sick, and you heal this lame man in Jerusalem. Really? Well, I have a guy who's sick. Let's go over there. That's probably what's happening. Is that they're going just for the miracles, not just because of the message of Jesus. And that will be John's point later on. That's what he's going to be focusing on, is that the people are coming out just for miracles, not coming out for Jesus. But Matthew, Mark, and Luke will say, like after this event, immediately after when Jesus walks on water, that's when he started healing the sick in the communities. It's also kind of an interesting comment to the people around there, because Jesus is not healing them, the people who are present for the feeding of the 5,000, but he's healing other people that are coming to him in Capernaum. The reason that Jesus can heal people is because he's healing them through faith. So the people following him here, he's not healing them because they do not have faith, but he will be healing people afterwards because they have faith. Okay. Jesus went up on a mountainside. That's also interesting because John is the only one who mentions the mountainside. The other accounts just mention this being by the shore. And you go like, oh no, is it on the mountain or is it by the shore? It's actually both. If you ever get a chance to actually look at the Sea of Galilee, you can see that there are hills jutting out right there next to the shore. So not a big deal. Finally, Jewish Passover festival is near. So there are two other times the Jewish Passover festival is mentioned in John. We covered one we haven't gone to, but I think it's pretty obvious. So do you know, do you have a guess when the Jewish Passover feast was in other places in John?
Talking about the crucifixion just before.
Just before, yes. In fact, John makes a note the Jewish Passover festival was near, right before the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. So,
Palm Sunday.
Yeah, well, right before Palm Sunday. Yeah, and there's one other one. We already covered it. Not quite.
No.
Confused. This book has all the answers.
I'm sorry, I'm confused on the question. You said when was Passover and somebody.
No. There are three times the Jewish Passover feast is mentioned in the Gospel of John.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So it's once here, once with the triumphal entry and clearing the temple. Yeah, there we go. Yes.
But
When was that?
Clearing the temple, when Jesus cleared out the temple. Yeah.
Oh,
Sorry, were you gonna?
no.
Oh, okay. So this is connecting. Okay, yeah, and I'll also mention John is the only one who mentions this is next to the Passover. So the reason why John is mentioning that is that he's trying to connect this to specific times in Jesus' ministry, especially the events going on at the time. So with the Passover, with the clearing of the temple, cleansing of the temple, Jesus is trying to remove the untoward elements in the community. He's trying to purify things. And in the following discussion, like later on in chapter 6, not just the actual feeding, but later on, we get into Jesus actually speaking the truth about himself, and then a clear division being made between the people, the few who stay and the many who leave. With the entrance into Jerusalem, Jesus is again coming into the community to cleanse people of sin. Basically, he's dying on the cross for the forgiveness of sins. And there he's also making a division between the clean and the unclean, where you have those who are saved by his work, those who are not saved by his work. But Jesus is actually making this available for all. So he's not just clearing the temple for a select group to come for, he's clearing it for all the people that who are there. With coming into Jerusalem, he's not just saving a select group, he's doing it so the entire city can see. Jesus is trying to make this available to all. And when we actually get to the feeding of the 5,000, all the people are fed, those who are in the faith, those who are outside. Everybody is there for this. But ultimately, if we're also thinking about the Passover, we're going to be thinking about the Passover feast, the actual meal. And that's also what we have to keep in mind here. Oh, and also because it's the Passover, it's been a year since the clearing of the temple, and it will be a year until Jesus Christ's death.
just over there.
Yeah. So we actually get a bit more of a structured timeline because Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't mention the times of the feast, so we don't have as clear a timeline. Oh, well, sorry, no, we have a clear timeline in them because they follow this very specific pattern. John is terrible at that timeline. He just goes, this interesting event, this interesting event, this interesting event. But John gives us, it happens at this time. The other gospel writers don't do that. And also a little bit of an interesting note that I picked up reading one of the commentaries was that with the Jewish Passover, this happens. There's a specific time of year, the month of Nisan. And the Nisan, it's actually a time when the grass would be full, which is one of the reasons why Jesus tells the people to sit down on the grass. And the wording there actually corresponds to the Greek translation of the Old Testament for Psalm 23, where the shepherd makes us lie down in grasses green. So we actually have a vision of paradise here, the invitation to paradise. It's interesting. I didn't even know that before. Yeah. I think I got everything there. I think I got all the little differences going on now.
The pastures green with quiet waters, that sounds pretty wonderful. And
Oh,
the
yeah,
23rd song, because he refers to the waters.
Yeah, and the night, because if you look ahead a little bit to Jesus walking on water, this is him calming the water. So you have the grass is green and the calm water, which is fun. Fun to think about. Okay, so let's get into the actual events. So we'll be going verses 5 to 15, a good chunk there.
When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 8 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each one to have a bite. Another of his disciples, Andrew, son of Peter's brother, spoke up. "Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will they go among so many?" And Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in that place, and the men sat down, about 5,000 of them. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed those to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. When they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over, let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. After the people saw the miraculous sign that Jesus did, they began to say, "Surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world." Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself.
Okay. So this actually follows fairly well with what's going on in the other gospel accounts, the actual flow of events, but there's a few things unique to John. In the other gospel accounts, you have the disciples say, "Oh no, it'd take 8 months' wages," or in the original 200 denarii to feed all these people. But in John, he says it's Philip. He actually identifies who's asking this specifically on behalf of the other 12. Also unique to John, Andrew is named because it just says the disciples presented a boy to Jesus. John is also the only one to mention that this is a little boy, but that's not a big plot point there. The only other major difference is verses 14 and 15, where the people try to make Jesus king. That's not really a big thing with Matthew, Mark, and Luke. What those gospels are trying to focus on is they're trying to focus on Jesus' actual miracle. So Jesus has control over the natural realm. So he can multiply bread and loaves, and then he walks on water. He has control over nature. And then those gospel writers, they go into, well, Jesus can also heal the sick and cast out demons. And so Jesus has ability to heal the world. That's what they're focusing on. But John's not focusing on that. John's going to be focusing a little bit more about the world against Jesus Christ, the worldly misunderstandings of Jesus versus his divinity. But yeah, also it's interesting that Philip and Andrew are mentioned. So Philip, he comes up by name 4 times in John's Gospel. The first time was when he was with John the Baptist. So Philip was the one to get Nathaniel. Nathaniel was the guy who was like, oh, can anything good come out of Nazareth? Philip says, oh, no, you have to come see this guy. Now he comes up again in chapter 12. So this is immediately after the triumphal entry. The Jews are going, what's with this guy? But the Greeks who were in Jerusalem at that time, they go, oh, hey, Philip, can you ask this guy for us what's going on? Can you come speak to us? So Philip goes to get him. And then the last time, chapter 14, Philip asks Jesus, show us the Father, and Jesus replies, well, those who have seen me have seen the Father. So we see Philip kind of come up where he's trying to mediate people to actually see God, to actually come to God, see salvation. So that's his role. So if Jesus is specifically asking Philip, that's probably what's going on, is that Philip comes up when he's trying to go, hey, whoever you happen to be, Nathaniel or the Greeks or anybody in general, let's go see God, see the salvation, see the Christ, and then you just come over to Jesus. Andrew, he comes up 2 other times in John's Gospel. Also, time to John the Baptist. He's actually in a different event. Andrew is the one who brings the message directly from John the Baptist that Jesus is the Christ to Simon Peter, because they're brothers. So Andrew immediately takes the message, John the Baptist, behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. He immediately gives that to Peter, so Peter can be renamed Peter and come follow Jesus. And Andrew is also one of the guys who helps the Greeks come to Jesus in John in chapter 12. Because Philip's the one they immediately ask him, and Philip grabs Andrew, and then they bring the message over together. So Andrew, appearing next to Philip, is also a helpful follower who's basically trying to mediate things over to Jesus. So he's not necessarily the one who's trying to get people to see, but he's the one who's a go-between. So it makes sense that, hey, here's this little boy, here's Jesus, he has food, we need food, why don't I just put these 2 together? And that tends to be Andrew's role in the Gospel of John. Let's put these 2 things together. Yeah.
I wonder what they were really thinking when they put those 2 things together, though, because 5 loaves and 2 fish. Like, it's almost like, why would they even bring that to Jesus' attention? It was such a small amount.
Hard to say. Well, it could be that Andrew had a bit more insight than Philip, because, well, it says there in verse 5, where shall we buy bread for these people to eat? And then he asked this only to test him, Philip, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. So Jesus already had in mind. Philip didn't really get it, and to Philip's credit, nobody knows what Jesus is talking about. I mean, like, this is Nicodemus, this is the woman at the well, this is the Jews who witnessed the paralyzed man walk. Nobody knows what Jesus is talking about.
visualize this crowd of 5,000 people, and I can't imagine how, and that's a lot of people.
Oh, it is.
They'd be so far removed from where Jesus was. I don't know how they'd even know what was going on. I guess word would spread in the crowd, I guess.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think if you see some of the political rallies that go on nowadays, not like the protests or the riots or anything, but if you see some of the political rallies, like, yeah, it makes sense that you can get a huge crowd together. They're not necessarily organized, but you can get a fair amount of people at one location.
No PA systems or anything.
No. Well, that's probably why they're at the mountainside. Because it doesn't mention it here, but there is, the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount is Jesus on top of the mountain, but there's also an instance, and I can't remember exactly when it was, when the people were sitting on the mount and Jesus went out in a boat on the actual Sea of Galilee, and then that's a natural amphitheater. Because the sound would reflect off the sea and would actually go to the mountain, and then everybody's graduated up there. Yeah, actually, having been there myself, it's fairly easy to make sounds go from the sea to the shore. Other than that, yeah, it's going to be a little bit chaotic, especially if the people are not coordinated among themselves. Because the other gospel accounts where they're saying like these are people coming from the surrounding villages, so they don't necessarily know each other. They're just coming up in weird clumps. Yeah.
But then Jesus can make himself heard even farther
If
away.
he wanted to. Well, actually, yeah, that's the speculation about the Sermon on the Mount, which is the actual wording for that is Jesus spoke to his disciples, so he was actually speaking to the 12 for the Sermon on the Mount. And what the speculation is that when Jesus is speaking to the 12, you have people on the fringes going, okay, this is what he's saying, and then they're just telling whoever is near them, and then you kind of get a game of telephone going, where the message of Jesus is spreading out to everybody. Because with the Sermon on the Mount, oh wait, I should just look at this one. I don't think it actually gives a number. Yeah, it just says crowds. But if they're using the plural for crowds, that means there's quite a few people there. Maybe not 5,000 people, but quite a few people. So it might be broadcast from whoever is at the center to whoever's outward. The other speculation is the disciples heard it, and then they just went out and told the people around them, which is more or less what Matthew does anyways, when he's actually writing down this gospel, because he was more than likely one of those who was communicated to by the disciples at some other time. So Matthew was actually called afterward. I think he was called. Where was that? Yeah. So he was called in chapter 9 of Matthew. The Sermon on the Mount was chapters 5 to 7. So odds are Matthew was called after that, and was just told this is what happened on the mountain. Everybody, because again, this is a different culture. Everybody's memorizing things with their ears. We've kind of lost that ability because we have television, we have radio. We don't necessarily need to remember everything that we hear. They did back then. Before there, where you can actually just write everything down. You have to memorize everything. Yeah.
I've been to Iceland, and there's the two continental plates. They hit each other in the middle of Iceland, so they don't hit at the same altitude. There's one vertical wall being the edge of the western plate, and the eastern plate is down below there. So at the bottom is where the first, well, the chieftains of Iceland were met to form the first parliament for Iceland. So at this point, there was dirt going up to a small hill, but there was a big vertical rock wall behind them. So if anybody stood in front of that and spoke, then the wall behind them would have reflected the sun. And they had a fellow who had memorized all the laws, and every meeting there, he would be the speaker of all the laws. So everybody would get refreshed. So maybe the mountainside was not a hillside, but a cliff, like.
For the Sea of Galilee, I don't remember any geographical features like that. Yeah.
We crossed it, but I can't remember. I remember crossing it, but
Like there were a couple of valleys kind of like that, but I don't remember like anything right on the water.
Just go to Norway. Everywhere it's vertical.
Oh no, yeah. I don't get too many places like that at least in Israel, because it's not quite on a fault line. It's next to a fault line. Yeah. It's not quite a fault line. Yeah. But also, yeah, somebody speaking into the rock face. That's what they originally designed some of the altars to be like, because these were all east-facing altars, so they were all on the wall. So the pastor was always speaking to the altar, which is why they tried to curve the altar in a few key locations, so that when you're speaking directly, the pastor speaking directly to the altar, the sound will. Yeah. Then you get to the latter half of the 20th century, and then people move the altar out, and then you go behind it, and then you don't have to worry about that. Anyway, let's see. A small boy with 5 barley loaves, 2 small fish. This was interesting to me. Probably not going to be interesting to you. John is the only writer to specify the type of loaf. He's the only one who mentions barley. In fact, the word barley in the New Testament only comes up here, like in this passage, and in not as this comes up as an adjective here, as a noun, it comes up one other time. Revelation 6, verse 6. The pale rider who comes out and he's saying, actually, let's guess what he's saying. Revelation 6:6. Yeah, then I heard, this is John speaking. Then I heard what sounded like a voice among the 4 living creatures saying, a quart of wheat for a day's wages, and 3 quarts of barley for a day's wages, and do not damage the oil and the wine. So basically, he's talking about extravagant prices, which would only come up during famine. So the pale horseman is proclaiming famine, and this is the only other time barley is mentioned in the New Testament, which is interesting. I haven't quite thought, I'm not entirely sure what he's trying to get at. The best guess that I have is John's trying to get at, this is some of the less expensive feed. So it's not wheat, this is barley, this is a lesser quality grain. And it's usually reserved for cattle and for the poor. So the reason why it's coming up with the pale horseman is that while you have this lesser quality grain and you don't necessarily like it, but you're still paying through the nose to get it. So that's what I think is going on. But I also had a note from one of the commentators that sometimes barley is used around the Passover. I don't know why. mean, I guess it's a little bit easier to bake without yeast or something. Anyways. The other, again, interesting to me, not necessarily to you. The word for fish. Fish come up a decent number of times in the New Testament. The word for fish here is unique to John. Only comes up here in chapter 6 and again in chapter 21. And it's specifically the word for cooked fish, which makes sense because John is a fisherman. That's how he got his living. So of course he's going to be a little bit more specific about what type of fish is here. So it's not fresh fish, it's cooked fish.
I wondered about that. I wondered if it, two small fish thought they were, not cooked. That's interesting.
Yeah. And one of the weird things is fish are not actually important to the New Testament. The only time they actually come up is when we get the disciples fishing. That's the only time it comes up. It's not really used as a metaphor for anything. The closest you come is the fisher of men. And you can try and connect it that way. Don't get me
Yeah,
wrong.
that's a Christian symbol.
Yeah.
The ichthus, yes. Oh, here, let me. There we go. It's a Christian symbol for a specific reason. So they go, and in Greek, you have sorry, I'm doing capital. There we go. Again, capitals. There we go. I'm so used to writing in, what am I doing? Yeah, you can tell I'm very used to writing in lowercase. No, I had it right the first time. Sigma. So this is an I, of course, with this is a CH, TH, a U, and an S. So ichthus, that's the word for fish in Greek. And this is basically standing for, if you use each letter to begin a new word, Jesus, Jesus, Christus, Christ, Theos, or sorry, Theou. No, wait, no, it is Theos, Theos. So, God, you, yes, that's the gender, that's not that's gender. Son of, and this is soter or Saviour. So the reason why, there we go. Yeah, the reason why they use the fish is because it's an acronym. So it's Jesus Christ, Son of God, Saviour. That's how it came up. You've seen that before.
No, I don't think I have.
Oh, okay.
I don't remember ever seeing it.
Okay, that's what it is.
I said it's God's son, Savior. So,
Well, yeah, so in Greek, word order doesn't necessarily matter. What matters is the case ending. So this is what's called the nominate case or the subject. And this is genitive, so this is a description. So it's God, son of, or if you have to switch this around in English, then it's son of God. Yeah.
How does that connect to the fish?
It's an acronym. So fish equals ichthus in Greek. Ichthus.
And they're taking it letter by letter.
Yep.
Clever. Have you seen the bumper sticker? People have the symbol of the fish, and I've seen quite a few, but then I remember seeing one that obviously was not a Christian. It was a fish that looked like it had legs.
Yep.
And they have feet.
Yeah, then it has feet in it and then it says Darwin. Because
Yeah.
it's kind of mock Christian.
Darwin, yeah.
Yeah,
That I would rather say, well, actually prove to me with science that you've actually documented a fish that grew feet.
I'm sorry, did you?
There aren't any.
I missed that. Would you mind repeating it?
Oh, I would say, well, actually show me a species of fish that grew feet and came to be a completely different species. Because we don't have an observation of that.
I know.
It's all speculation actually now.
Yeah.
My response is, well, why aren't they still becoming? Like, why don't we if evolution exists,
No,
why is it stopped? Why don't we still
Exactly.
have apes walking out of the forest as humans? Like,
I know, yeah. Well, basically, whenever I hear atheists try to grapple with that question, they always go, well, evolution can't explain that, and then they just come up with whatever answer they can possibly get. One of Richard Dawkins, do you know who that is?
Yes.
One of the foremost atheists there is. He's made his name basically trying to argue Christians into the ground. He absolutely hates all religion. Wrote the book The God Delusion, The Blind Watchmaker. So very militant atheist, known as one of the four horsemen of the new atheism. Anyway, I watched him, like there's a video of him online where some people actually asked him, like point blank, why don't we see evolution today? Like, why don't we actually see this occurring? And his response is absolutely sad. Basically, he's saying, well, what you see today, like what you don't see pre-evolutionary fish that were developing into all these animals, you just saw, you're now looking at fully evolved fish. So what? The process of evolution is supposed to say that nothing is fully evolved, everything's developing. So how can you?
Very interesting.
But basically, yeah, he couldn't come up with an answer at all. I've also seen people try to grapple with this, not necessarily just Dawkins, but people grapple with it by saying, "Oh, we're evolving. Don't mistake us. We're evolving, but we're just evolving in a different way depending on how our society actually acts." So because there's no big threat to humanity in this day and age, natural selection can't just get rid of all of us. So now we're selecting whoever's better skilled for jobs or more intelligent, because those are the people who can afford more children and get more kids out there. Now, that isn't, because that can't actually explain away all the current genetics in our gene pool, can it? Because people will still be breeding, and you still have all those genes going from group to group, even those who are theoretically more intelligent than others who are now capable of sustaining more children. And it would take millions upon millions upon millions of years to actually edit out any non-genius traits of the human species, according to evolutionary theory. So even if people are arguing, well, we're evolving now and we're evolving to be more intelligent, no. What they're actually confusing this with is something called neuroplasticity, where the brain adapts to different types of information. So with the disciples Sermon on the Mount and then hearing everything, and even with the Icelandic fellow who's memorizing the laws as they're being developed. Well, that's just how their brains function at that time. You hear something, you retain that, and then you spout this off. Currently, we can't do that because our brains have shifted because we're dealing with different types of information and try to process it differently. So we're dealing with times where we have secondary memories. We can actually write things down. We don't have to memorize the entire New Testament. We can just have the New Testament. Then, for us, what we actually memorize is how to get the information. So you go, well, I want to look up, let's say, the feeding of the 5,000. Well, I remember that's John chapter 6, and then all you have to do is look at John chapter 6. So you've memorized one piece of data, you haven't necessarily memorized the entire thing. So this is an actually measurable phenomenon called neuroplasticity, and there's been quite a lot of scientific papers developed on it, but people are now claiming that, or some people claim that this is a product of evolution.
It's actually changing the education system. They don't teach content anymore as
Yeah.
much as how to access the content.
Yeah,
Is what they're
exactly.
actually teaching.
Exactly, yeah, that's just what we're doing now.
I'm
First,
sorry,
I have to be a little bit ineffective.
sorry, Pastor. Unfortunately, I have to leave for another
Oh.
meeting, but I'll watch the rest of this later.
Okay.
You're recording it, right?
Yep.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
But no, yeah, you're absolutely right. This is something that's moving more and more towards that direction, where we're putting more and more emphasis on what you could say secondary memory or external memory, by which we call, say, books, writing, now the internet, digital data banks. And now we're trying to figure out, well, how can we access data? And I would argue that this isn't necessarily helpful, because you still need to have a basic level of knowledge in order to function, which is why I'm scared for the current generation being brought up. I'm still scared for my generation being brought up, because a lot of people in my high school were not terribly intelligent. Also, that's just my opinion. They were being told, you have to know this in order to be out in the world. But I don't.
I think mathematics is a good example of that, where we had to learn the old fashioned way. No calculators when I was in school.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great example, because even in my engineering courses, it was a great stretch for a lot of the engineers taking these math courses to actually function without a calculator, because you couldn't bring a calculator into an exam, because you can program the calculator and bring on anything you want. So you weren't allowed to use it. And they all tried to make questions that you can actually do make calculations with this. So that's where actually I was at a disadvantage, because they always made questions that didn't need a calculator. But when I found that, oh, I have this fraction 256 divided by 463 or something like that, I'm like, oh, well, how do I reduce this or find a numerical value to express that? And then I would actually work that out. And I didn't realize, oh, I shouldn't have gotten that stupid fraction in the first place. They made it easy. They weren't expecting us to actually do the math. But no, yeah, it's even in the universities now where they're trying to do that. Yeah. Anyway, guess a little bit off topic, but yeah. So evolutionary theory, what I find is every time you get a new scientific discovery which completely destroys the evolutionary theory of the past, well, then they just make up a new version of evolutionary theory and say, well, evolution explains this anyways. And it's very dogmatic. People claim that, oh, you need to believe in science, you can't believe in religion, but secular science has become its own religion in many respects. Because, well, it can't possibly be wrong, so then you just create whatever loopholes you need. The common complaint against Christian and Christian science, Christianity and Christian science, I mean, is a god of the gaps, whereas scientific achievement keeps progressing and progressing and progressing. The amount of God-related activity in natural events keeps shrinking, so you keep saying, well, God is responsible for less and less of the natural world. Well, there's also a science of the gaps, in my opinion, where you have great big scientific theories, and then as you become more and more precise, you actually realize there's certain elements that you cannot explain, and then you keep trying to explain them away by your secular science, and it's becoming increasingly difficult to do so. So there's a science of the gaps. There really is. Again, I digress. We're talking about fish. You're talking about fish. Okay, so yeah, John is the only one who mentions the term cooked fish. It appears here in this reading, then again in chapter 21, which is the only other time we talk about fish anywhere in John's gospel. And for that reading in chapter 21, this is the third appearance to the disciples. So after the resurrection, the disciples decide, hey, let's go out and fish. 7 of them anyways. And they catch nothing during the night. Jesus, crossing along the shore, says, hey, cast your nets on the other side. They do. They catch, I think it's 153 fish. And they go, oh, well, that's Jesus over there. And then they go to shore and they find Jesus has prepared bread and cooked fish. So therein is a minor feeding of the 5,000, except it's a feeding of the 7 disciples. And that's also where you get the reinstitution of Peter. So Peter denied Jesus 3 times, so Jesus must forgive him 3 times. And each time that Peter is forgiven, Jesus says, feed my sheep. So what Jesus is hinting at is something in this reading where we have Jesus being the bread of life. So what's Peter supposed to feed the sheep with? Jesus, bread of life given by God. Okay, right. Last thing related to food. The importance here is not so much that Jesus has multiplied so many bread and fish. That's the emphasis in the other accounts, Matthew, Mark, Luke. They're looking at, well, see how Jesus can control all things natural. John's emphasis is a little bit shifted in the sense that he wants to show Jesus' specific supply to the people, his providence. So the emphasis here is not so much that Jesus has mastery over all things, but there was stuff left over. And quite a bit left over. And I may be reading a little bit much into this, but you have 5 barley loaves, so 5 low quality pieces of bread, which may correspond to the 5 books of Moses, I don't know. And then you have 12 baskets left over. 12 baskets, 12 apostles. So Weinrich, the guy who's giving the commentary, he was saying that the importance with the overabundance is that the bread is actually left over. Because this is specifically relating to Passover and to manna, because Jesus is going to bring up manna later on. Manna, given in the desert, so this is bread from heaven. You're supposed to go out and gather what you needed each day. Do not leave anything till morning. If you leave it till morning, it's going to be infested by maggots and rotting. So only have what you need every single day. The bread Jesus gives can actually be collected. You don't need to eat all of it because it can sustain more later on. So Moses gave bread, or Moses gave bread, and it wasted away. Jesus gives bread and it remains. So, and you also might notice that the 12 baskets were filled with pieces of the bread. They were not filled with pieces of fish. So we're only focusing on the bread. What's going on with the bread? Well, we don't care about the fish. Let's focus on the bread. So if we're thinking, or if I'm thinking, the 5 barley loaves represented Moses, maybe the 5 books of the Old Testament. Again, that's a little bit tenuous. Going to 12 baskets with the 12 apostles there. Well, maybe this is Jesus actually transforming the old into the new. And the apostles are left with bread that remains so that they can continue going out and feeding the sheep. It remains in this world so that you can continue to feed and feed and feed and feed. Because if Jesus is giving you bread, well, he can multiply it forever. I mean, he only had 5 loaves, he multiplied it for an entire crowd, so why can't he take whatever bread remains and then multiply it for everybody else in the world? So the bread that's given to the small Christian church on earth now, which is at least 12 members for the disciples, well, why can't that be the same for the entire world? Never ending, never perishing, always remaining in Jesus Christ, who is life everlasting. Covered mostly. Okay. The response. So this is verses 14 and 15. Unique to John, because this is going to be his main focus and the main source of conflict for the speeches that follow. So after the people saw Jesus perform the sign, the miracle, they began to say, surely this is the prophet who has come into the world. So they mentioned the prophet. The people asked John the Baptist before, are you the prophet that Moses spoke of? So Moses prophesied, Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 15, 18, that there will come a prophet after him who will lead the people. And a lot of people think that this corresponds with the Messiah. In fact, apparently there was a Jewish tradition that the second giving of manna would actually signal the coming of the Messiah. So the people are assuming that you have a second giving of manna, multiplication of bread, so this must be the Messiah. So they're not wrong. This is the prophet that Moses spoke of. But what they do with this information that Jesus is the Messiah, they completely misappropriate. Because in verse 15, Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. So the Jews wanted to make him a worldly political leader, and even if you take by force, well, a military leader, but Jesus was actually supposed to be a spiritual king. If we get to much later on in the Gospel of John, when Jesus is speaking with Pilate, he says, my kingdom is not of this world. He admits to being the king, but his kingdom is not of this world. So the people, they seem to have fundamentally even a misunderstanding of Moses. Because if we're taking this in a political view, what did Moses do? What did Moses do?
Led the people.
Out of captivity
Out of captivity.
into the promised land.
Yeah. The captivity part is apparently what they're focusing on. Because at the time of Moses, you had the greatest nation on the face of the earth, or at least one of the greatest nations on the face of the earth, the Egyptian kingdom, taken down by God. Just completely thrown out with the 10 plagues. So if you have the second Messiah and your kingdom is under the rule of a foreign power yet again, the Romans, and also the Idumeans, so this is King Herod. So he's the Herods are technically not Jews, they're Edomites. So of Abraham, but not quite. Edomites descended of Esau, the brother of Jacob. Jacob is also known as Israel, so the Israelites are descended from Jacob. Edomites descended from Esau. Never really got along in their history. Not that they were always enemies, but they never got along. So Israelites, they have no political leaders. Their political leaders are foreign powers, the Romans, the Edomites, and they want to get rid of this. So they go, hey, let's make Jesus king by force and we'll get rid of all these foreign powers, just like Moses got rid of the Egyptians. That seems to be the force. They're not necessarily looking to, hey, Moses was given command of the people so that they could be forgiven their sins, brought under the law of God, and brought into the promised land. Their promised land is the land won by force. Yeah. This is going to come up as we go through the rest of chapter 6. Specifically the worldly aspect versus the spiritual aspect. Okay. Any questions before we? Nope. Okay. Let's try and get verses 16 to 24.
When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not come yet to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." Then they were glad to take him onto the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. On the next day, the crowd remained on the other side of the sea, that there had been only one boat there, and that Jesus had not entered the boat with his disciples, but that his disciples had gone away alone. Other boats from Tiberias came near the place where they had eaten the bread after the Lord had given thanks. So when the crowd saw Jesus was not there, nor his disciples, they themselves got into the boat and went to Capernaum seeking Jesus.
Yeah. So Jesus removes himself, and nobody really knows where he was until evening, where he and the disciples go out on the lake. So apparently, and I was reading, I think it was a commentary on the book of Mark, talking about walking on water. Apparently, it's actually safer to go out on the Sea of Galilee when it's dark, because there's less wind at night. I don't know. So that's when you go out fishing is at night. And I wasn't really thinking about it before, but yeah, usually whenever fishing comes up in the Gospels, they're doing it at night. This is when you do it. So the disciples go down to the lake, it's dark, and Jesus was not quite with them yet. So John follows, and I was looking at the synopsis again. So John actually follows Matthew and Mark in immediately going from the feeding of the 5,000 to the walking on water, because this is like right the next day. So in verse 26, where it says the next day, what that means is the next day from the feeding of the 5,000. So it's not Jesus appeared on land, then he was feeding for an entire day, and then the day after that, then the people thought, no, it's immediately the day after. Yeah, and also interesting, Luke does not record the walking on water, so yes, the feeding of the 5,000 remains the sole miracle, if you're not counting the resurrection, the sole miracle that all 4 Gospels talk about. No other miracles talked about in all 4 Gospels. So Feeding of 5,000 apparently very important. So walking on water, John actually gives the briefest account because this is not his focus. The other two, Matthew and Mark, they want to emphasize Jesus having power over creation and mastery over the natural elements as God would. And we also find a little bit of that in John, not very declared, but it's still there. Because if we're looking at water paired with darkness, this seems to be a reference to Genesis chapter 1, where before the creation, the world was formless and void, and the Spirit was hovering over the waters, and then God says, "Let there be light." So for the disciples, they were very scared until Jesus comes in. Even a strong wind blowing seems to be a slight reference to the Holy Spirit. Not exactly, but it seems to be an offhand reference to that. So John is going, yeah. This is kind of a creation thing where God has mastery over the elements, but that's not John's focus. Even following this event, where you get back to shore and then people find Jesus, it doesn't say why the people find Jesus or where or what he's doing in John. But in Mark and Matthew, what they're putting emphasis on when they find him afterwards is Jesus is healing people. So odds are somebody was healed by Jesus, started walking away and say, "Hey, there's this miracle worker over there, and he healed me." And they're like, "Oh, that was Jesus. We were searching for him to heal us before." And then they wander over there. But yeah, John doesn't really talk about that, but Mark and Matthew would, because their focus is, well, we have to show Jesus having mastery over the natural elements and also over sickness and disease. If we're looking at the focus of kingship, well, John retaining the elements of the creation account, well, that also makes sense because God is mastery over all things. All of creation is under him. So why would Jesus need to be king over Israel, political king over Israel? It's unnecessary. What we actually need to do is see Jesus tell off the people who are trying to make him king. That's what we need to see. Yes. Also very interesting. At least, again, this is interesting to me. Tell me if this isn't interesting. If I'm not being interesting, tell me I'm not being interesting. This is interesting to me. When I was going through the commentary, it was trying to liken if the multiplication of bread is related to the manna in the desert, and we know this because Jesus explicitly brings that up later on, then the walking on water here seems to be more of a reference to the parting of the Red Sea. So we're just taking the event of the Exodus in and of itself. But actually, I'm going to disagree with him. I don't think this is the crossing of the Red Sea. I think this is the crossing of the Jordan River. This is not talked about as much. So I don't know if you remember, but after Moses dies, and he dies right before the people entered the promised land, because he committed sin, so he can't enter into the promised land, God forbid it. His successor, Joshua, he takes up the mantle of the prophetic leader of the people, and he leads the people across the Jordan River into the promised land. And the people are led in procession as God has directed them. So you have the ark first, and as the ark is going to the Jordan River parts, and the people can pass through. The entire nation of Israel can pass across the Jordan River into the promised land. So you have another parting of water, another baptism, if you will, and coming into the promised land. And I think that actually works a little bit better with Jesus, not just because Jesus is walking on water after the manna or multiplication of bread. So you have an order of the events correct. But Jesus actually corresponds better to the figure of Joshua than he does Moses. Joshua, or Yeshua in the Hebrew, Yeshua takes up the mantle of Moses, and he actually brings the gospel. Moses brought the law, he failed the law, he died. Joshua was supposed to be representing the gospel and the coming into the promised land for the people. He was the one who is actually going to conquer the evil forces, the forces of sin in the new land that the people are coming into, so that they could live there and receive their inheritance forever. Jesus, in Greek, Jesus, or in Hebrew, Yeshua. So Jesus' name is Joshua. It just becomes Jesus in English because of the merry little route of languages that we get from A to B. So Jesus, also Joshua, he does take on the mantle of the law, if you will, the mantle of Moses, because all the people are under the yoke of the law. But he actually brings people into the gospel. He's the one who actually accomplishes the task Moses never could. And he actually is bringing people into the promised land. So when you also think, well, if the lying down in the green grass, receiving food and drink, to your betterment, likened to Psalm 23, that this is the good shepherd that leads you into paradise. Well, it makes more sense for Jesus to actually correspond to Joshua and actually bringing people into eternal life at, like, right here in chapter 6. We come into eternal life, resurrection to come, but we're also brought into from death of sin to new life in Christ here and now, which was Jesus' point in the previous chapter, was that, yeah, if you believe in me, you have a life already. This is passing from death to life. But the physical resurrection is one to come. Yeah. So Jesus is very much taking on the mantle of Messiah, taking on the mantle of successor to the law, and even taking on the divine name. In verse 20, where he says, "It is I, don't be afraid." It is I is a way to try and translate it into a way it makes sense in English. What Jesus actually says is, I am. I am. Fear not. You know, like, that's weird. What's with this weird grammar, Jesus? But what he's actually doing is he's taking the divine name. So the divine name, Yahweh, I am who I am. Jesus says, I am. And everything is calm. He takes on the role of the creator and everything becomes calm. Interestingly enough, this is also true in Matthew and Mark's account. They also have Jesus just say, I am. So Jesus saying, I am, divine name, he's the creator of all is present to calm the horrible aspects and actually bring confirmation of new life to the disciples. So he's actually bridging the gap of fear and chaos to paradise. And paradise actually looks a lot like the realm that the disciples knew beforehand, because they land right where he gave the feeding of the 5,000. So familiar to them, but renewed. Does this make sense? Am I going off on weird tangents that people don't like?
Last comment, they didn't land back where the feeding happened. They landed where they were heading.
Yeah, immediately reached the shore where they were heading. So I was looking at this a long time ago when I had to do a sermon from Mark on the feeding, no, sorry, on the walking of this on water. So what happens is they set out from where they were. So this is Gennesaret, near to Capernaum. The disciples head out on water. Jesus goes off into a mountain to pray. Disciples remain on the water. Jesus comes back. They then go to Capernaum. And it says, opposite shore and all that. These are awkward ways to capture the expressions of the Jews at that time. The opposite shore basically meant a different area of the shore instead of going to the exact opposite across from you. I don't know why they do that. It's just something with how they understand this. But you're going to where they're heading, which was Capernaum. And then they actually come down, and it says, then some boats from Tiberias landed near the place where the people had eaten the bread after the Lord had given thanks. So this is the area of feeding the 5,000. And once the crowd realized that neither Jesus nor his disciples were there, they got to the boats of Capernaum in search of Jesus. When they found him on the other side of the lake, they said, Rabbi, where are you? So they're going back to Capernaum. And so it's the same area, but not quite. Yeah, I was looking at this a lot. I think I was preaching on this last summer. Yeah, it doesn't make too much sense.
So it sounds like the boat advanced on natural speeds, like Jesus made it possible for the boat to get where they were going, because it says immediately.
Yeah,
The
immediately.
boat was at the land to which they were going. The word immediately makes it sound miraculous.
I don't know. I'm saying, like, I actually don't know, because with immediately, that could just mean, well, there is no delay. Because I'd actually have to do a bit of a deep dive to see how John uses that word. If you actually see the word immediately come up in Mark, well, everything's immediate. Everything happens right after the other. But if you actually compare Mark to one of the other gospels and see that he immediately skips over like 2 or 3 events, then you're like, oh, okay, then what does immediately mean? It could just mean that Jesus just has a mind to get to that event, so then you're just heading that direction. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's not much of a delay. So for John, I'm not entirely sure if that means zoom, they're there. It may just mean that they were able to get there quickly, especially now that there wasn't any wind, and then they could just move out fairly quickly.
Were they rowing or were they had the sails up? So.
Usually they would have their sails up. I haven't seen any archaeological finds of oars, so I don't know like what type of oars they would have.
Earlier in the chapter,
Yeah, it says they
They
wrote
rowed 3 or 4 miles.
Oh, okay. I just want to see what the Greek is. Maybe that will give me an idea of exactly what wrote. Okay. It doesn't necessarily mean literally road.
Of course not.
It can mean that. Okay, yeah, it can also mean by wind. Because of course it can.
Well, I can see if it's strong wind, the wind would either be against them or with them.
Yeah,
Probably.
when they're rowing.
Yeah.
Couldn't have been too big of a boat either, I guess. If they were rowing it.
It's a decent sized boat because they actually did find, I think it was in the 70s, the Sea of Galilee receded so much that they were actually able to find a a boat from, I think it was
Well, there's,
20 BC or
when
something.
we went across, once we got across, they
Yeah.
had a boat there. Displaying,
Okay,
they said
yeah.
they found in the,
Yeah, that
I
that
mean,
would be
it
yeah.
was good size, but it wasn't huge, but.
No, it would basically be from this edge of the table to that edge of the table.
Yeah.
Maybe a little bit bigger than that.
Yeah.
This is not big,
Well, that's not very big.
no. And you're trying to pack all the apostles in there?
No.
Yeah. And when you also think, like when Jesus calms the storm, and he's sleeping on the pillow in the back, well, of course, the disciples are, like, Jesus is not like under deck or anything. So when the disciples like turn over to Jesus sleeping, like, how can you sleep? It's right here, it's waiting on you. It makes a little bit more sense. Yeah. These are not big boats. These are not big boats. So yeah, it could mean literally road. It would make sense if they literally rode.
Would be kind of a shock when you're,
Yeah.
it's dark out, they're going in nighttime apparently. And then they see somebody on the water.
Oh yeah. Well, let's go to the other accounts here. Let's see. The Queen of the
Here at its
Providence.
widest point, Galilee is 8 miles across.
Yeah, it's not big.
Yeah,
It's small.
yeah.
That's why the NIV translates this as lake instead of sea, because that's what it is. It's a small lake. Walking on water.
Mine says 150 feet deep. And surrounded by hills.
Yeah. So in Matthew, when the disciples saw him walking on the water, they were terrified, saying, "It's a ghost," and they cried out for fear. And this is why Jesus says, "Take heart, it is I," or "I am, Yahweh, have no fear." Then Peter answers, and then he says, "Oh, is that you? Tell me to get out of the boat." And I'm like, "Come out," and Peter, and then Peter gets up, and he's like, "Oh yeah," and then he starts thinking. Peter's the fun one. He says some interesting things sometimes. Anyway, yeah, so they get pretty close to the land, and then I have to stop sharing for a moment. I know I have a couple extra notes near the end that were cut off by the printer. This is something. Okay. No, it's not where I wanted to. Okay. Yeah, got that. For Jesus. Oh yeah. So the people who were not with Jesus, the people that Jesus was trying to avoid, since they did not have Jesus among them, the light of the world, they remained in the darkness of the uncreation, the darkness of their own sin. So they were wandering around throughout the entire night, and they didn't see anything, and they only started seeing things when it was daytime. That's going to be pretty thematic when Jesus says, I believe it's chapter 9, when he's talking about blindness and spiritual blindness. Yeah, so John chapter 9, Jesus says, "As long as it is day, we must do the work of him who sent me," so do the work of the Father. "Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world." So the people wandering around, of course, they can't find Jesus in the night. They can't find it when they're spiritually darkened. It's only when Jesus allows himself to be seen in the daytime that they can actually see him. And they're only seeing him by where he's actually working, doing the work of the Father, because now he's healing people again. John doesn't mention the healings. Matthew and Mark do. But yeah, he's healing people in Capernaum. So yeah, they came to the same place expecting to see the same Jesus, but he wasn't there. And Jesus will now really explain to them what's different. So they're thinking worldly bread, they're thinking worldly means physical healing, but Jesus is showing them the true paradise, the spiritual food that they need to receive, the spiritual gifts that they need to come into. So this is what the healing truly is. It's actually coming into the paradise to come. Doing away with the sinful effects of the world. That's what healings are supposed to be. So they're only looking for the very worldly aspect of it. Jesus will now look into the spiritual things. So the discussion that we're going to get into next week is going to contrast this with the actual bread. So the people want worldly bread. Jesus is going to spiritual bread, the bread of life. Any closing questions, comments?
It's tough to roll in choppy water.
Yeah. Let's pray. Dear Lord, Heavenly Father, we thank you for bringing into our world the bread of life, Jesus Christ, who is also the light of the world. Please, Lord, guide us through Christ in all that we do, all that we say, so that we may constantly live in the life that he supplies us with and spiritually feast upon him in faith. In the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, we pray. Amen.